to the sixth talk, the fourth in line, in the ongoing series from Teachers Against the Climate Crisis. I welcome you on behalf of the Teachers Against Climate Crisis and the coordination team, including Nagraj, Mayank, and Rohit. So Teachers Against Climate Crisis is a group that seeks to explore, improve understanding, and deepen engagement with different facets of climate change among teachers, students, and the broader society. And before I introduce the speaker, I request everyone to please turn off their videos for better bandwidth, and I'll be muting everyone before our guest starts speaking. Please use the chat box. The icon is at the bottom of the screen on the left-hand side for questions and comments. Our speaker will talk for about 40-45 minutes or so, followed by a question and answer session. And the usual rules of web courtesy apply. So it's an honor and privilege to introduce our speaker today. Dr. N. Raghuram is Professor, School of Biotechnology, Guru Gobind Singh Indraprastha University in Dwarka. A modern biologist by training, he's a world expert on the functional biology of nitrogen and the nitrogen cycle, and has brought the crucial importance of these topics to the attention of governments, including the Indian government and the United Nations. He's chair of the International Nitrogen Initiative, director of the South Asian Nitrogen Center, and editor-in-chief of the journey Physiology and Molecular Biology of Plants. Currently, he's a member of the United Nations Consultative Committee on the Health and Environmental Effects of Fertilizers and Pesticides. He's also an award-winning teacher and communicator with a wide range of interests, including health, environment, education, science dissemination, and policy. I'm going to hand the mic over to Raghu in just a moment, but I'm going to start by muting everyone. So Raghu, please unmute yourself before you speak. And also please keep your phone handy as we'll communicate via WhatsApp in case there's a technical problem. And I believe the recording has already started. So let me go ahead and about to mute everyone. Welcome, Raghu.
Thank you.
Raghu, we can't hear you.
I can't hear anything.
Raghu, are you there? One second, I'm just calling you.
Yeah.
Raghu, we cannot hear you.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can. Yeah.
All right, so I was just trying to figure out how to unmute myself.
Okay.
All right, so can I begin?
Yeah, please begin. Yeah.
All right, thank you very much, Vandana, for a very liberal introduction. Well, if you pick it up from our website, it is basically meant to attract highly motivated students. Sorry for that. It's a great pleasure to be able to speak to such a diverse group of people interested in climate change and related issues of sustainability. As I've been mailing off and on, I believe the awareness on climate change is mostly limited to carbon, though there are half a dozen greenhouse gases listed in the various IPCC reports. They include nitrous oxide, NOx, and other compounds. For some reason, these have been initially expressed in terms of carbon equivalents for simplicity in science communication, but that became a bane for nitrogen because people understand nitrogen only as carbon. So even my own title was precisely meant to address that. So if I say nitrogen does this, nitrogen does that, then nobody understands. If I say nitrogen is a new carbon, people say, oh yeah, okay, now we get it. So that's the world we live in. So I'll just take the next half an hour, 40 minutes to give you a quick overview of where we stand with regard to the global understanding of the nitrogen cycle and how it impacts us, um, especially the reactive nitrogen compounds. Um, Not only climate change, but a whole lot of other more immediate effects on our well-being, and why, therefore, we need to address those things both nationally and globally. So, please let me know if you can't see my slides. I'm just moving those slides. So the main question is, why is nitrogen important for sustainability? Nitrogen sustains life on this planet Earth. In fact, even when the even in the origin of the Earth, it was considered that nitrogen was one of the key compounds in the origin of the nitrogen gas, actually, in the origin of the planetary system. Nitrogen constitutes 78% of the air we breathe. It is generally unreactive. Well, I should say mostly unreactive. You can force it to react by the Haber-Bosch process, but otherwise it doesn't react on its own and is fairly harmless. Um, but when you make reactive nitrogen compounds out of nitrogen, like nitrates, nitrites, NOx, nitrous oxide, nitrogen dioxide, these are highly reactive compounds and they can really cause havoc. So the natural cycle of nitrification and denitrification uh, that used to begin with the ability of a few microbes in the soil, which used to be able to fix atmospheric nitrogen and convert it directly into ammonia. So this was called biological nitrification, nitrogen fixation, because some of these microorganisms are also present in the root nodules of the legumes, various pulses and legumes. Some groups of plants, the legume family of plants, also acquired the ability to get the nitrogen requirement through this bacterial symbiosis. Other than that, there is no living organism on Earth other than these bacterial nitrogen fixers that can directly make use of nitrogen as an element. We cannot digest nitrogen, absorb nitrogen, use nitrogen. No animal can do it, no plant can do it, only a few microbes can do it. So microbial action was the original source of conversion of unreactive nitrogen to reactive nitrogen in the early evolution of life on this planet. But some microbes also develop the ability to denitrify nitrogen. That means do the reverse process, convert ammonia back to nitrite, oxidize it basically, and then nitrite to nitrate, and then nitrite to elemental nitrogen. So the reverse of nitrification, which is called denitrification, which again puts back the excess reactive nitrogen in the environment back into the air as elemental nitrogen. This was the cycle for many millions of years, maybe billions of years on this planet Earth. So whatever little nitrification that happened due to bacteria, if there is excess reactive nitrogen in the Earth's environment, it was denitrified. Of course, when agriculture was invented by the early in the transition of hunter-gatherer uh, human to the settled civilization, human civilization, when human being domesticated the cultivation of legume crops, the biological nitrogen fixation was anthropogenically increased. So that contributed to a little bit of increase in the reactive nitrogen in the Earth's environment. But even then, that was not such a big problem, because for about 5,000 years or so, despite the growth of legume crops through biological nitrification, the amount of nitrogen pollution on the planet was still very minimal and well within the ability of the planet to repair itself. It was the invention of the Haber-Bosch process, originally invented for development of explosives, TNT, during the war research period, and that later was found out that if you can make ammonia from air, nitrogen in the air, by using the Haber-Bosch chemical process under very high temperature and pressure, the kind of temperature and pressure that causes Bhopal gas disasters. By the way, Bhopal gas disaster happened because it was an ammonia plant, and they were making many compounds using the reactive nitrogen that was captured. And cyanide also contains nitrogen, hydrogen cyanide. So the invention of the Haber-Bosch process produced reactive nitrogen from chemically, anthropogenically produced reactive nitrogen from unreactive nitrogen gas, and this became industrialized. And apart from what went into weapons, a lot of it went into fertilizer as ammonium nitrate. Ammonium nitrate is a double trouble. You can use it to make ammunition, you can use it to make chemical fertilizers. And much later, urea was found out that you can get it through naphtha and petroleum reserves. Overall, to cut the long story short, the invention of chemical process of manufacture of nitrogenous fertilizers has vastly surpassed the natural ability for denitrification. And for the next 100, we recently celebrated the centenary of the discovery of the Haber-Bosch process. So for about a century, nitrification was dominating denitrification, or denitrification was not able to cope with anthropogenic nitrification. So there has been, as a net result, a continuous accumulation of reactive nitrogen compounds in the Earth's atmosphere, in the air, in the water, in the rivers, in the underground water bodies, on the seas, etc. So as I said, as fertilizers, nitrogen compounds feed the world, and at least half of the world's population would not have been alive today if we had not been able to use nitrogen fertilizer. Because if you plot the growth in food production in the world over the last 100 years, you will see that population growth and food production growth parallel so closely that there would have been a lot more hunger deaths if you did not have some ability to put in the fertilizer. Of course, nitrogen is not the only thing, though it is quantitatively the largest input for agriculture. You of course also add phosphorus, but that is done by making a powder of phosphate rock. It is not a chemical process. Sulfates can be obtained both ways, and potassium is also obtained from minerals. So nitrogen is the only non-mineral source of fertilizer. Other NPK, the potassium and phosphorus and others, they are obtained from mineral sources. But the leftover nitrogen compounds, which the plants do not use, keep accumulating in the environment, and they become pollutants. Which means some pollutants are nutrients in the wrong place, and they actually cost us twice. First, to get these nutrients to support our food production, and then secondly to remove them from the gutter where they are accumulating. The Nazafgarh Nala, the Shahadra Nala, these were all rivers only a century ago. They became nalas because of heavy pollution, and a lot of that pollution is also excess nitrogen, phosphorus, sulfur, which are ideal nutrients for agriculture. So if this nala pani was actually used for agriculture, probably things would have been much better. Of course, nalas also have a lot of other things like heavy metals, plastics, etc. But the point I'm making is you need all these nutrients in the food production system. You end up finding them in the gutter. And removing them from the gutter costs us again as much as making them in the first place. So some of the nitrogen inputs, reactive nitrogen inputs, pollute air, such as ammonia gas, nitrous oxide gas, which is a 300 times more powerful greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide over a 100-year period, and NOx. NOx is a mixture of several oxides of nitrogen, which include nitric oxide, nitrogen dioxide. These are the two main oxides, and they mostly come from fuels or residue burning, or coal, organic burning, etc. So these are all the air pollutants. Even NOx compounds can be 10 times more reactive than carbon dioxide over a 100-year period. That's not all. Some nitrogen compounds like nitrates also pollute water, and most freshwater drinking water is maintained in potable state because it does not have nutrients that support a lot of growth of unwanted organisms. So one of the reasons why crystal clear water becomes muddy, and then later it becomes blue green, and then green, and then brown, and eventually black, this is because of growth of different organisms in the water as per the availability of different nutrients. So this process of conversion of uh, water with very low microbial load becoming highly microbial contaminated water is called eutrophication. Uh, so together, both air and water pollution, of course, the soil is an important medium for both. Um, they cause adverse impacts on our health, environment, climate change, livelihoods of people who depend on different natural ecosystems like a river ecosystem, or fishermen, or the sea, and so on. Therefore, the impacts are far more serious than climate change. So that's one reason I said nitrogen is much worse than carbon. It has impacts lot worse and more immediate than climate change. And of course, urban environments are the worst affected, also because of the high density of population and due to high scale of consumption, as well as high scale of waste generation. Lastly, and this is a point that I will spend about half of my talk on, that is that just like we've had the carbon assessments that led to the global cooperation on minimizing the accumulation of carbon dioxide and carbon monoxide and methane in the world's atmosphere, we need national and global assessments of reactive nitrogen compounds in order to help domestic actions, evidence-based policies for minimizing nitrogen pollution at the national level, as well as for intergovernmental cooperation at the global level. So this is in a nutshell the current nitrogen cycle as it operates. As I told you, the natural cycle only used to have nitrification either due to lightning in the sky that would electrically convert nitrate to nitrogen gas to ammonia, or oxides of nitrogen, whereas in the soil it was the microbes which were able to convert nitrogen gas to ammonia. These were the only two natural nitrification processes. But today we have three major processes: the energy production process, or even energy consumption process, um, or the food production process, or the lifestyles, the people, food, fiber, etc. These three processes uh, make a major impact on the natural nitrogen cycle. And as you can see, there is a cycle in the agro ecosystem where crop nitrogen is picked up from the soil, and crops are eaten by animals, herbivores, and herbivores are eaten by carnivores. When either plants or animals die, the nitrogen compounds are recycled back into the soil by microbes. So this is a cycle that operates in the agro ecosystem. Then there is a grassland and forest ecosystem where there is cycling between plant and soil, and then there is a exchange between soil and water when seepage of nitrates happens to the groundwater bodies, or when surface runoff of excess fertilizer in the monsoons going from fields to rivers and from rivers to the sea. There are also volatilization losses, gaseous losses from all these systems, either chimneys of industries, or your exhaust pipes of your vehicles, or various other burning, including biomass burning. They all release NOx gases, and agricultural fields also release ammonia. Some of the unused fertilizer goes out as ammonia. NOx mostly comes from vehicles and energy sources, very little from agriculture. But ammonia and nitrous oxide come predominantly from agriculture, including from the urine and dung of farm animals. Some of them, like ammonia nitrate compounds, NOx, they become deposited on dust particles as particulate matter, PM 2.5 and PM5, the two most important particulate matter for our health, actually have various nitrogen compounds that make up to half of their chemical composition. So together, anthropogenic activities, whether agriculture, fertilizer, animal husbandry, even for that matter, poultry, fisheries, especially captive, aquaculture, where you add nitrogen compounds as fertilizer even for aquaculture, and energy production, transport, all of them together contribute to highly increased accumulation of reactive nitrogen compounds. So you have two basic problems here. A, A, there are multiple sectors of human activity that produce nitrogen pollution. B, there are multiple compounds of reactive nitrogen that cause nitrogen pollution. So it is not like just carbon dioxide, not one molecule. It's a whole mix of half a dozen molecules, and both air and water. So in a nutshell, this is what it is. The most important compounds are in this table. Ammonia coming from fertilizers, animal dung and urine. Nitric oxide and nitrogen dioxide coming from industries and vehicular exhausts and biomass burning and so on. Nitrates becoming a source of pollution when sewage and fertilizers, etc., land up in water bodies. And nitrous oxide coming from both crops as well as from industries, accumulating. According to an extrapolation from European Nitrogen Assessment, the cumulative nitrogen losses from the Earth's environment are worth about $200 billion a year. My colleague, Professor Mark Sutton from the Center for Ecology Hydrology, UK, and he was my immediate predecessor. He was the chair of the International Nitrogen Initiative before me, because he led the European Nitrogen Assessment, and then that made him a candidate to take over as the chair of the INI. I co-led the Indian Nitrogen Assessment, and therefore inherited the chair of INI from him, because there was no other country which did nitrogen assessment on such a scale anywhere in the world. So the main sources of pollution can come from fertilizer runoffs, wastewater, including our domestic sewage, livestock waste, power plants, transport emissions, and fertilizer plants. All of them can contribute. Now this is an interesting graphic, because it tells you that out of the many important compounds in air pollution, this is CPCB table, which of them have health effects, which of them have acid rain and eutrophication effects, and which of them have climate effects. If you can see, carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, hydrocarbons, NOx is the one compound. Actually, you should also have had the nitrous oxide here, which is N2O. NOx and N2O have both health effects, acid rain effects, eutrophication effects, visibility effects, as well as climate effects. So the only air pollutant that checks all the boxes is actually reactive nitrogen, not so much the carbon. Even particulate matter, I just told you that PM, particulate matter, half of it, up to half of it, can be various nitrogen compounds. So which means NOx and PM together contribute to all the various effects that are known, both in terms of our health and environmental and climate effects. And by the way, World Health Organization has recognized air pollution as one of the major killers in the world, and 29% of all lung cancers happen due to air pollution. 24% of deaths due to stroke happen due to air pollution. 25% of deaths due to heart disease, 1/4 of all deaths due to heart disease are attributed to air pollution. Up to 43% of lung diseases, you're talking of corona here, 43% of all deaths due to lung diseases are attributed to air pollution. Thank corona, which has at least removed the 43% problem, and it kills only 0.5% of the population it infects. We have a much bigger, 100 times bigger problem than corona on hand. Now this is what I told you, PM 2.5 levels. If you rank the world cities, 14 out of 15 worst cities in the world, including Delhi, happen to be from India. This is PM 2.5 pollution, and up to half of 2.5 pollution is because of various nitrogen compounds deposited on the particle, and the health impacts are mainly because of nitrogen. The black carbon soot deposition is not as dangerous as nitrogen deposition. So these are the various other sources of PM 2.5 pollution: vehicles, dust, power plants, diesel sets, households, waste burning, etc. Also, in India alone, 1.6 million deaths every year are attributed to air pollution, and this is WHO data. And on the global map, you can see in the middle, the darkest spot in the whole world is India or South Asia, because that is according to WHO regions, and the highest number of deaths are in South Asia due to air pollution. So that is 2 million deaths, but India leads the entire South Asia trends in air pollution deaths. Out of 2 million South Asian deaths for air pollution, 1.6 million are from India alone. And the bottom graph is data of 2017. Actually, all of this data is of 2017. This is color coded by number of range of deaths. The darker the color, higher the number of deaths. age standardized deaths per 100,000 people. So other than Afghanistan, India and Pakistan are together in this. They kill the same number of people by air pollution, much more than what they kill for other reasons. India is also a global hotspot for ammonia emission on the top, other than small parts of coastal Africa and parts of North America and Brazil and China. As you can see, the northwest part of the country, going right up to the tip of the northeast, is a huge ammonia cloud. This is a satellite image of 2018, and the bottom picture is of European Space Agency 2019 picture of NO2, nitrogen dioxide, which is an important constituent of NOx. So nitrous oxide, which is a greenhouse gas, India is an important not nitrous oxide. Uh, India is 5th or 6th in nitrous oxide generation in the world. The top map is of ammonia generation, where India seems to be a global hotspot, and the bottom map is of nitrogen dioxide emission, which is NOx, uh, where China seems to be a much bigger problem than India, but still, out of the 3 or 4 hotspots of the world, India does figure. You can see Europe on the top, the darker spots, and you can see South Africa at the bottom. You can see India, and then China, and North America on the left. Now, one important thing is that out of all the sources of nitrous oxide to the world's environment, if you look at various regions of the world and their contribution of nitrous oxide from various sources, you will see that the tallest bar is of China, the second tallest bar is of South Asia, but within each bar, the pink bar is from waste, and the green part of the bar is from soil, which is actually agricultural soil. So the point I'm making here is that out of all the individual sources that contribute to nitrous oxide, in every part of the world, farm soils are the biggest sources of emission of nitrous oxide, which means agriculture is the biggest source of nitrous oxide emission all over the world, much more so in South Asia and China and Latin America. Now, this is a picture that many of you climate change enthusiasts would have already seen. This is a way of visualizing the capacity of this planet Earth to tolerate certain abuses made through various activities, um, environmental abuses. The green zone, this is in concentric circles. The green zone depicts the safe operating margin. The yellow zone can be reversed with some effort. The red zone, not all of it can be reversed, but the outermost circle is the planetary boundary. One can debate whether the boundary is accurate, but it doesn't matter because the trend still remains the same. I'm saying this because this has been one of the controversial types of visualization of climate change. But it still conveys a very, very important picture. If you look at the 2 most important red zones that have crossed the outermost circle of planet Earth, it is genetic diversity and reactive nitrogen. The second most important is phosphorus. Okay. In fact, climate change because we have been talking about it and trying to arrest it in the last 30-40 years. Hopefully we are still in the yellow zone, and we haven't entered the red zone. But genetic diversity, we may have already lost a lot of species which we will never be able to get back, and some of the reactive nitrogen damage may never be reversed. And uh, I'm not focusing on the remaining part of the environmental issues because you are already aware of them. Now, this is a list of 17 sustainable development goals which have been adopted after the Millennium Development Goals, which could not be fulfilled, were renamed and extended as Sustainable Development Goals and expanded to a bigger list of 17. Nitrogen is invisibly present in up to half of these Sustainable Development Goals. For example, I told you half the world's population is sustained because of the ability to give nitrogen inputs for agriculture. Our health is impacted by nitrogen. I told you about PM 2.5 and deaths due to air pollution. Our ability to get clean water, SDG 6, is heavily impacted by nutrient pollution of our water bodies. Our ability to get affordable clean energy depends on how much we can limit NOx coming out of energy production. And our ability to have responsible consumption and production also means responsibility in minimum generation of reactive nitrogen uh, production, because we need reactive nitrogen for certain activities, and we also need to limit our consumption and minimize waste. And climate action, of course, nitrous oxide is 300 times more powerful than greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. NOx is 10 times more powerful. So climate action, nitrogen is very much there. Life below water, because in Manila Bay, in the Rhine River in Germany, in parts of US, uh, there is a huge death of aquatic life, and fish uh, population has gone down so much that people can't even do fishing there. So life below water, which also sustains livelihoods of fishermen, uh, depends on minimizing nitrogen pollution on water. Life on land uh, depends on not wasting nitrogen compounds, because sometimes you may end up getting unwanted growth of weeds and plants or other species when you have a nutrient that should be kept uh, at the minimum level for maintaining the ecological balance. So these are the unfortunate problem is that even though nitrogen is a legitimate part of up to half of sustainable development goals, there is no single sustained intergovernmental process or goal dedicated to nitrogen. On the other hand, several global bodies have been, over a period of time, uh, taking interest in reactive nitrogen issues. Of course, not only the INI that I represent, it also the UNFCCC, though it is so, it only talks of nitrogen as equivalents of carbon. So you don't hear of nitrogen, but actually they also talk of nitrogen in terms of carbon. The Convention on Biological Diversity, because many species are changing because of changing nutrient balance in the ecosystem. UN Convention on combating desertification. We had the conference of parties last year in Delhi. Some of the desertification is happening because of mining away of nutrients from the soil through repeated agriculture and not putting them back by any means, organic or inorganic means, and therefore soils are becoming increasingly deprived of nutrients and they are becoming deserts. Deserts are growing in the world. And then the long range transboundary air pollution under the UN ECE also has a major nitrogen component. The UNEP Global Partnership on Nutrient Management, GPNM, of which I am a steering committee member, also deals with nitrogen pollution, more specifically in the aquatic and marine bodies. Global Soil Pollution Partnership and International ITPS, I forget the full form, and the emerging body called INCOM, Interconvention Coordination Mechanism for Nitrogen. So these are all the various international bodies that are already beginning to take note of the importance of nitrogen, and I'll tell you how an emerging intergovernmental process is taking shape. Last year, I was able to co-author this report for UN Environment. It's an annual report, which is nowadays called Frontiers Report, and it highlights the emerging issues of environmental concern for Earth. They invite proposals for multiple submissions, and then they shortlist. Last year, they shortlisted 5 most important threats to the planet Earth, and nitrogen was picked up as one of them. And we submitted a report on the global status of nitrogen, which was released as a part of this Frontiers report among the top 5 threats to the planet. During the last UN Environment Assembly, 4th Environment Assembly in Nairobi last year, in March last year. So now I will spend a little time on telling you about how agriculture is an extremely important aspect, though I mentioned in the beginning about fertilizers. But here I will show this whole role of agriculture in the global nitrogen pollution using a leaky pipeline model. So you can see 2 big pipelines in the center. They have holes on top as well as in the bottom. So the holes on the top are basically symbolically, we are talking about losses to the air, and the holes at the bottom are symbolically losses to soil and water. And this pipeline gets nitrogen compounds as inputs, either from nitrogen fertilizer or microbial biological nitrogen fixation, even biofertilizer, or nitrogen deposition from rain. When rain happens, it washes down some of the reactive nitrogen compounds back to the surface. And when that happens on a forest, you might unwittingly end up fertilizing a forest, because you are carrying reactive nitrogen compounds through air, and then when there is rain, the dissolved nitrogen compounds land up as fertilizer on the forest. So we've had examples like this in some parts of eastern India. So we provide inputs into this pipeline, and then we take some outputs from the green part is the agriculture pipeline. And what are the outputs? We take the harvested crops, but some of the output also becomes the input for animal production, like hay, straw, even poultry, um, livestock, cattle, all that. So crop production in many ways is also producing feed for animal production. So that is a output of one becomes the input of the other. Some of the animal output like manure comes back to crops. Unfortunately, in India, this part has been neglected, and too much reliance on fertilizer, it meant that we are wasting a lot of manure. That's a separate problem. And again, from animal production, we take outputs like meat, milk, eggs, etc. So, but the leakages are there in both processes. From agriculture, crop agriculture, we leak ammonia, nitrous oxide, very little NOx, and a very little atmospheric nitrogen gas. But to the water, we release a lot of dissolved ammonium compounds, nitrates, and dissolved oxides of nitrogen. Similarly, from animal production, we release ammonia, nitrous oxide, NOx, and very little denitrified nitrogen gas. If the denitrified nitrogen gas was able to balance all these other compounds, there would not have been a problem. So what are the impacts? The four corners, the pictures on the four corners are the impacts. There are biodiversity changes, species balances, weeds, pests, pathogens, they all increase. On the right, climate change impacts. On the bottom right, you see red tides um, due to eutrophication. On the left corner, you see green tides due to algal blooms in highly eutrophicated water bodies, and you can see dead fish um, which can't survive in such waters because the dissolved oxygen is not enough for them to survive. So this is another interesting thing that came out of the European nitrogen assessment. This only talks of the um, synthetic chemical fertilizer that is used in agriculture. Out of 100 units of fertilizer you add to a crop, if you are a vegetarian, you end up getting only 14% of it on your dining table. The rest is lost, either because the plant can't take all of it, or because you don't consume the whole plant, or because there are wastages in food processing, etc. Ultimately, what you really retain in your food is only 14%. But if you're a non-vegetarian, this can be as low as 4%, because there is a huge loss when the plant that is produced with fertilizer eventually becomes a feed for the animal, and you don't consume whole animal, the animal wastes a lot in the process, and therefore what you get is only 4%. One of the problems of fast economic growth in South Asia, including India, is that the rate of non-vegetarianism has been growing um quite fast, and this means there will be a pressure on the food production system, and there will be more leakages of nutrients from the food production system, especially nitrogen. Now I talked about eutrophication, how it happens. So this is just a cartoon that shows, various activities, residential activities, industrial activities, and then animals, feeding in pastures, and then there is surface water runoff, or urban wastewater, untreated sewage, or even a river. All of them eventually land in the sea, and in the sea you get the algal blooms, and that's what causes all the problems. This kind of pictures are being generated for educational purposes as a part of the Global Partnership on Nutrient Management under the UN Environment Program, and this is one of those graphics produced last year under the Global Nutrient Cycle Project. Now this is an actual story of how the globally reported harmful algal blooms have happened and increased tremendously since 1980s. As you can see, the actual picture of ducks swimming on totally green water, that's the density of algae, green algae that have grown on it. After some time, these green algae are replaced by brown algae when they don't get enough sunlight just below the surface. So below surface, the brown algae grow and they overtake, and eventually red algae grow. So that's why you have green tides, brown tides, and red tides. You can see the brown tide already in the bottom picture. So on the right side, you see that the time scale on the x-axis and the year on the y-axis. The size of the circle and the color of the circle indicate the range of concentration. Okay, the darkest circles have the highest number of algal bloom events. The smallest, lightest circles have the least events. So prior to 1987, the number of events of harmful algal blooms were barely in single digits. But since 1987, they became more than 50 events per year. And now in 2017, you have more than 500 events per year of algal bloom events, because they happen as events because the tidal character and seasonal changes, etc. It doesn't mean that the whole sea is green all through the year. It uh, some eventually it becomes that, but you can start seeing these events initially coming as seasonal changes. The number of times they come is the indication of seriousness to the ecosystem. So 500 events of algal bloom is quite a lot. My colleague Bob Diaz from US has produced this slide which shows all the red dots are the places where eutrophication and algal blooms have been reported, and yellow dots are either those which are going in towards the uh, that direction, uh, or green dots are those which we were able to reverse them by timely action. So the fact that we were able to reverse some of the eutrophication zones, up to 60 such zones, is the good news, that whatever might be happening, may have happened in the past, if we decide to act, we can still recover quite a bit of what has been lost. And that's a very, very important message uh, that this picture drives home. And this is a very recent picture developed by my colleague Stephen Porter. Uh, no, this is from the UNEP GPNM report. Over a period of 50 years, from 2000 to 2050, what is the amount of nitrogen addition that you expect will happen? The top one is about dissolved inorganic nitrogen. That means we are talking of water bodies. And the bottom one is about dissolved organic nitrogen to the water bodies. So these two pictures, the most intense red color is addition of more than 250 kg of nitrogen per kilometer square per year. By the year 2050, that's the range that we will reach if we don't act now. And in the case of organic nitrogen, we might add around 80 to 100 kg n per kilometer square per year, but that's still quite a lot. Because please remember, drinking water sources or even recreational water sources, like beaches and rivers, where you can take a bath, are those water sources which have very low organic pollution. Inorganic content is tolerated up to some point. You may not drink the water, but at least you can bathe. But if you have organic pollution compounds, then it becomes unsuitable even for taking a swim, or uh, it can start smelling foul. You can't even enjoy a ride on a boat. So next 15 minutes, 10 minutes I'll spend on the Indian civil society approach for nitrogen management. There was a Society for Conservation of Nature started by Professor Yash Abrawal when he was as a senior scientist and professor at Indian Agricultural Research Institute in New Delhi. When I came here and joined this university in 2002, we set up the Indian Nitrogen Group under this registered society. Even as early as 2006, we realized that after the carbon battle is settled, the West might use a nitrogen handle to beat us. Because most of us know that when the first IPCC report came, extrapolating some figures based on the carbon loads generated from Western countries, it landed up on us like a bomb. We had no idea where this data came from. We had no idea how these calculations were done. It took us many years to figure out and calculate our own loads and rebut some of these claims, correct all the reports, and reverse some of the uh, apportionments of blame. but then decades have been lost in the process. So our question was in 2006, if we were to face a nitrogen bomb today, as in, I mean, not literally, but like the carbon case, how ready are we? What lessons have we learned from the carbon experience that prepares us better for a nitrogen battle that might just happen, whether we like it or not? So that question led us to set up the Indian Nitrogen Group, independent of the International Nitrogen Initiative, which was also just formed somewhere in US, in University of Virginia, actually, in 2003 by James Galloway. So they did not know us, we did not know them, but within 2-3 years, we became their South Asian Nitrogen Center. We became the regional office, and I was heading that office before I became the INI chair. We also joined the UNEP Global Partnership on Nutrient Management as an NGO partner. We set up the Sustainable India Trust to more specifically focus on the sustainability issues arising out of nutrients in 2015. We also partnered with the South Asian Intergovernmental Cooperative Program on Environment called SACEP, South Asian Cooperative Environmental Program, for nutrient management at the South Asian level. We carried out the Indian nitrogen assessment without any government funding or without any industry funding, simply by working evenings, late evenings, holidays, vacations. A team of 20-30 committed research scholars and faculty over a period of decade just produced the Indian nitrogen assessment in civil society mode, totally free. And then, of course, the government was kind enough to own it up and showcase it in the World Environment Day in June 2018, where we held a session on. It was held in Delhi, that the World Environment Day 2018. So the Indian government held a session on nitrogen, which we had conducted for them, and now we are actually extending the Indian nitrogen assessment to the South Asian scale as a part of a UNEP GEF project on International Nitrogen Management System. In fact, it is we from India who argued vehemently for 5 years in UNEP that any credible global nitrogen assessment system has to be based on the strong pillar of national or regional nitrogen assessment. You can't have a global assessment without a regional or national assessment. Otherwise, we'll end up repeating the same mistakes that happened in the early decade of IPCC. The world has no time for making all those mistakes and correcting them. We don't have time for acrimony on your data versus our data. We need to work together. We need to have national and regional assessments as a part of global assessment. We need to have the governments and the scientific community on board, including the civil society if possible, so that when we all sit together on the world platform discussing nitrogen, we will be discussing from a position of strength of data rather than mutual suspicion that characterized much of the carbon negotiation. But before we embarked on the Indian nitrogen assessment, we had to do a lot of other smaller products to identify the right authors, the people who were dedicated to the purpose without funding. And so as early as 2005, we produced a policy paper for National Academy of Agriculture Science, and then we produced an edited book in 2007. This was released in the INI conference in Brazil in 2007 December. 2008, we brought out a IGBP scope report for the Indian National Science Academy, and then I guest edited a special issue of Current Science on reactive nitrogen with a dozen articles covering all aspects of the nitrogen cycle: air, water, river, coastal, energy, agriculture, even satellite, everything. And these articles in that particular issue got 10 times more citations than the average citation value of Current Science itself. We later also did a special issue on phosphorus for current science, which is also getting a lot of good citations. And of course, eventually we did the Indian nitrogen assessment in 2017, which was published in 2017. Now, this is a very telling picture which we had from 40 years of rice experiments in the Indian Rice Research Institute from one of our partners, uh, both Tapanadhya and Himanshu Pathak, who have been directors at the National Rice Research Institute, Cuttack, have given us this data which shows that the partial factor productivity of nitrogen, which is the black graph, decreased continuously as the fertilizer consumption for food production increased continuously. Of course, these are on different scales. You can see the primary and secondary axis. But the important point is, since Green Revolution, within a decade or so, uh, we have saturated our soils with the amount of nitrogen they required. After that, our yields were not dependent so much on nitrogen, they were dependent on something else, but we kept on pumping more and more nitrogen. So, therefore, the partial factor productivity of nitrogen, which is one of the definitions of nitrogen use efficiency, was declining. We actually generated a district-wise map of fertilizer consumption in the entire country because we found out that many of the global maps were extrapolating data from Punjab and
Hello, Raghu. I'm sorry, but we can't hear you. It's also getting time to wrap up. Let me see. We may have to. The screen is frozen. I see other people. Yeah, sorry, Raghu. Are you there?
Yes.
Okay, great. We couldn't hear you for a while, but also I just want to let you know that we should be wrapping up in a minute or two so that we have time for questions.
Sure. Yeah, okay. So this is about the reducing nitrogen use efficiency, and we also carried this district-wise map in the UNEP report called Our Nutrient World in 2013. Now, this is the Indian nitrogen assessment book that was published with over 60 authors from India, mostly one or two from abroad. They were Indians from abroad, and because they had so many sectors, we needed multiple editors to represent those sectors. 500 pages book with 31 chapters covering all the areas: agriculture, agroforestry, livestock, aquaculture, mangroves, coastal systems, atmospheric emissions, health, transport, energy, industry, everything has been covered. And based on the Indian nitrogen assessment and its highlighting in the World Environment Day in 2018, we were able to convince the Indian government to move a resolution in the UN for sustainable nitrogen management. You probably know that India never had success in moving any UN resolution for various reasons. But this was one of those cases where India actually succeeded in getting a unanimous resolution passed in the 4th UN Environment Assembly. This resolution was tabled by India, defended by India over 5 days. I actually had to volunteer to help the diplomats in negotiating it, and was eventually adopted. So now we have, for the first time, intergovernmental acknowledgement of reactive nitrogen as a problem, and a statement of intent that it requires sustainable nitrogen management. From here follows all the important actions that the world has to take. And this is just a recent update. In the last decade, 2010 to 2019, we have just mapped the state-wise fertilizer consumption. As you can see, Karnataka was actually consuming more a decade ago than now. The darkest color is highest consumption. whereas Madhya Pradesh, which was consuming less a decade ago, has now consumed more. So these dynamics are very important because agriculture is a state subject, and a state like UP have always been consuming more, and Punjab was consuming more earlier, but now Haryana also got added to it. So these dynamics, we are now able to provide evidence for decision making. And if you look at the long-term trends or the source-wise apportionment, if you rank all the nitrous oxide sources, agriculture is at the top, accounting for 70%. But the second most important is wastewater, sewage, solid and liquid waste. That was a big surprise. Okay, up to 12-13% of total nitrous oxide was coming from waste. But the interesting thing is, if you look at a decadal change from 2000 to 2010, you will see that agriculture is way below at 3.44% annual compounded growth rate. But the ones which are changing the fastest are wastewater, navigation, aviation. So this was another reason why we did the Indian nitrogen assessment, because we did not want agriculture to become a target of international criticism, because the same thing happened in carbon. Now we are able to show that agriculture growth rates are stable or very marginal, whereas other sectors are growing at double-digit rates. And by 2022, I anticipate that wastewater will surpass agriculture as the single largest source of nitrous oxide from India. Already it has surpassed methane as the second largest greenhouse gas from India. So this is a long-term graph from my colleague Himanshu Pathak's paper. So the methane from 1970 to 2010 has not increased much, whereas nitrous oxide increased continuously. So therefore nitrous oxide today became more important than methane, second most important greenhouse gas from Indian agriculture. And yet people don't talk about nitrogen. This is about the subsidy for fertilizer. We can come back to it later in the questions. But within agriculture, 60% of all nitrous oxide emission comes from agriculture. The remaining come from energy and transport. But where the 60% comes from, out of the 60%, up to 77% is only chemical fertilizer, which is mostly urea for India. Where is this chemical fertilizer used? 37% in rice, 24% in wheat. So if you combine wheat and rice, or cereals in general, more than 2/3 of all urea that goes into Indian agriculture is essentially used for cereal production, which means food security. Whereas in China, it is mostly horticulture. So in different countries, there are different parts of agriculture that account for bulk of their emission. So these are very important for informed decisions. Otherwise, we end up beating the wrong sector. Well, these are examples about neem coated urea, that it has reduced the nitrous oxide emissions significantly. When the whole of the country shifted from plain urea to neem coated urea, it is acting as a nitrification inhibitor. But we also showed that by replacing half of the urea with, let us say, farmyard manure or biofertilizer or compost or a mix of all of them, you can get the same yield and still save half of the urea. So this is a part of a demonstration in the Indo-UK project, which we just concluded, where we showed that 50% reduction in consumption of fertilizer can be possible by replacing it with organics. This is the India map for ammonia emission, extrapolated from some of our field level measurements during the Indo-UK project. A lot of it comes, this pie got into trouble. Don't believe this pie, I think it got spoiled, but the map is correct.
Hi Raghu, if I can just come in, maybe
Yeah.
you wind up the presentation in a minute. So I think we
I think so. Yeah, I'm more or less done.
Yeah, sorry if you don't mind. Yeah.
Even though
One more minute.
we have shown that up to 50% of fertilizer can be replaced by organic farming, or more. But zero budget natural farming is not a correct way of organic farming unless they really use a lot of manure which they are not allowed to use. In fact, very recently we showed that 50 to 80% deficiency in nitrogen can be caused by zero budget natural farming practices, and soil carbon might increase, but phosphorus might also decrease. Food production on a national scale, if you extrapolate, it may cause food shortages of up to 50%, I mean 48%. So this is the scenario projected for urea reduction. If we use neem coated urea and place a few already known policy measures, and this is of course crop residue burning and fires all over the country. We only think it is Punjab, Haryana, but entire country is guilty in crop residue burning. And these are the outputs from crop residue. From poultry also, there is a lot of loss of about 1 million ton. Right now 500,000 ton, but it may grow up to 1 million ton because poultry is growing with non-vegetarianism. And cattle, buffalo have in fact remained more or less constant, so that is not much of a problem. And if the Gorakshaks continue, it will not be a problem at all. Groundwater nitrate has been a major problem in many cities of the country. These are all the important cities, and 50 micrograms per liter, milligrams per liter or microgram per ml is the WHO safety limit, and you can see that up to 8 to 9% higher levels are there in groundwater in most parts of the country. And this is sewage growth trends over the years, with urban population shown in blue. So we have to arrest that or recycle that. And wastewater scenario, there can be a lot of saving if we can bring some of those nutrients to agriculture. And this is transport. Most of it is due to aviation and road transport. And diesel is the biggest culprit, which includes aviation diesel. And all the gains from CNG in Delhi were lost when diesel vehicles came into personal transport. This is a major policy blunder. We did not have diesel vehicles as personal transport prior to entry of CNG in Delhi. All the gains of CNG were lost when diesel cars were introduced, and they totally messed up the whole environment. And these are the NOx emissions and mitigation scenarios. There is a huge reduction possible. And this is from power sector. You can see the actual map from European satellite 2019 of NOx emission, the hotspots in the north half of India. So these are the important key actions. We can improve nitrogen efficiency in agriculture, transport, waste, and societal consumption. And there are more detailed nutrient management policies being developed for global cooperation. You can skip these things. The last slide. The International Nitrogen Initiative has been working since 2003 with 6 regional offices, including India now. We held 7 triennial conferences that generated the conference declarations for international attention to nitrogen. INI declarations are what led to the UN resolution now over the years. And this is the various existing intergovernmental processes with which INI cooperates to bring attention to nitrogen. We believe that because countries don't want to invest in yet another convention for nitrogen, and there is anyway some nitrogen in all these existing conventions, we might have an inter-convention mechanism for nitrogen. So that's the way forward as we see it. We have an INI conference in Berlin, which was supposed to be between 3rd to 7th May 2020, day after tomorrow. But now that has been postponed due to Corona. But we are going to have a curtain riser on 4th May, which will be 5:30 Indian time, and I can share the link for those of you who want to attend. Welcome to INI. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Raghu, for an incredibly informative and fascinating talk, and especially for your valuable work bringing attention to on nitrogen issues to the world. So everyone, we please put your questions in the chat box. I have a few myself. I haven't typed them in yet. But if you could please do that, then I see we have one question from Nagraj. So Raghu, if you can open your chat box, you'll see it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, where is the chat box?
Lower left-hand side.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's nothing there as of now.
Okay. Should I just read Nagraj's question?
Okay, now I can see.
Okay. Okay. Great.
For PFPN, it is partial factor productivity of nitrogen. Out of the many inputs you use for a crop, what is the amount of crop output that can be attributed to nitrogen? Which is also another way of measuring nitrogen use efficiency. What's the other question?
Raghu, you responded to my question. My question was actually to do with urban pollution, because there's been a lot of talk about how our cities have got a lot cleaner, the air a lot cleaner. But as far as PM 2.5 and so on are concerned, and nitrogen inputs into that are concerned, what are the kind of clear measures that could be taken? I mean, you mentioned the shift at the end of your presentation. You mentioned that shift, the diesel cars, etc. But that's something that's probably here to stay. So, what are the kind of measures that could be taken to sort of reduce, in a sense, end pollution in Indian cities in particular?
Well, see, there is a lot of peri-urban dairy farming that goes on. Okay, around Delhi, there are a lot of these private dairy farms where they produce a lot of milk and milk products for the city consumption. And this is our white revolution. But they generate a lot of urine and dung which they don't recycle. A lot of that either goes into groundwater or evaporates and goes into air. One of the tragedies of Indian development in the last half a century has been our green revolution and white revolution have gone in opposite directions, so much so that crop farmers don't keep cattle and animal livestock farmers don't grow their own grass, and they have no means to use the dung they produce. So the result is the stubble is burnt rather than fed to the cattle, and here the dung is also burnt rather than being used as a manure. So this is the problem. We have to basically restore the link between green and white revolutions, because the output of one is the input for the other.
I see.
So,
and for PM 2.5, the other important issue is if you can, of course, now with the Euro 6, the nitrogen emission limits are very, very tight. Earlier, the problem was much of our emission norms were centered around carbon. In fact, the Automobile Research Association of India told us that because all pollution control is centered around carbon, all rules are defined around carbon, sometimes we have to have a trade-off. To come under our catalytic converters require calibration. So to stay within the carbon limit, if you let off more nitrogen, so be it, because there is no rule against nitrogen. So this was one of the problems. But now in Euro 6, NOx is also clearly mentioned, and hopefully that should bring down a bit. Otherwise, petrol is not such a problem. Petrol does not produce so much NOx. It's only the diesel. And personal transport was always petrol, scooter, motorcycle, car, auto, everything was petrol.
I see.
So our dual fuel policy was actually very good. Another important thing, before Chidambaram came and made housing loans cheap and increased HRA, owning your own house for any salaried employee was something that people only planned for retirement. Employment automatically meant campus accommodation. All good employers, public and private, provided accommodation either on campus or very close to the campus. So people never needed to plan for their own house. If they did it only for post-retirement settlement. That was a very good thing. If we can again bring back, if for example, for Delhi, if Arvind Kejriwal says all public and private institutions which have more than 50 employees or some number, let's say more than 100 employees, must have to accommodate all their employees within 2 kilometer radius or within 1 kilometer radius, within walking distance. They just take all the nearby houses on lease. I know people who stay in Dwarka and drive all the way to Noida. And I know people who stay in Noida and drive all the way to Dwarka to my university. This is totally avoidable.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
There was a question about the peninsular India. I think
Raghu, go one by one maybe. There's a question from Prabhu.
Yeah.
After mine.
Okay. Yeah. So, as I said, one of the reasons why nitrogen pollution was not recognized as more polluting was because initially, even the West did not have any clear solutions. Whereas at the time when the IPCC started discussing carbon, for example, certain solutions were already available, certain technologies were available, like ozone replacement, CFC substitutes were available, certain ways of reduction of carbon emissions were available, and these countries were able to use these whole carbon issues to push markets for their own technologies. But for nitrogen, even they did not have much to sell. So probably that was one of the reasons. The other reason was that I think even IPCC, by converting all the nitrogen figures into carbon equivalents, for sake of simplicity of science communication or I don't know what, knowingly or unknowingly did a lot of injustice to nitrogen. Even today, IPCC does not have much appetite to talk of nitrogen. They talk of GHG, they talk of carbon. They never mention nitrogen. And Vandana said something about biodiversity. Yes, many thousands of species are supposed to have already been lost. How many of them can be attributed to nitrogen is a question that still needs to be resolved. There are studies happening in different parts of the world. We hope to arrive at some uh, credible numbers. At least I don't have those numbers with me right now, but it's a work in progress. I can tell you that. Also, associating air pollution with respiratory disorders, cancers, etc. A lot of these studies are also extrapolation from laboratory-based experiments in uh, animals, plus clinical data from hospitals. But clinching, cause effect evidence is something that still requires to be collected.
Thank you. That's very helpful.
Yeah, part of the problem was too much emphasis on climate meant that even many of the early nitrogen researchers were singing the same climate tune because they were so used to the carbon climate tune in carbon. So they start the entire nitrogen discourse with nitrous oxide. Whereas in reality, I think NOx is 10 times more prevalent than nitrous oxide. NOx causes immediate problems. Every government thinks that climate change is the next government's problem.
Raghu,
And
just sorry to interrupt you, Raghu. This is Naga. There's a
yeah,
request that you take off your screen sharing and show yourself as you're responding. We'd like to see you, so you can take your PPT off the screen and
excellent. I've done
join us.
that.
Yeah, please,
Can you
please
see me
carry
now?
on.
Yeah. So, as I was saying, uh, yeah, see, nitrogen has many effects. Carbon effect is mainly climate, but nitrogen also damages your health. It also damages your water bodies. It also damages your, soil. It does fish kills, many things. But because we are so conditioned by this climate logic, that many nitrogen researchers also tend to first talk about nitrous oxide, greenhouse gas, climate change, and no government wants to listen climate change, at least most. And every government thinks that climate is the next government's problem because everybody thinks that climate is a slow event. So governments only happen in 5 yearly cycles. So they think let it be the next government's headache. But the way we witnessed Delhi pollution becoming a prominent issue in Delhi elections, air pollution, respiratory disorders, NOx, particulate matter, these are more immediate political issues actually. So I'm beginning to now convince my colleagues all over the world, also because when Corona came, it is NOx that was reduced heavily during the lockdown. Globally, NOx levels have gone down, air quality has improved. So, what does it mean? It means that some of it would have been possible, though not through lockdown, but by other means. Some such control would have been possible. That it was not done is simply a proof of lack of proper governance on the environmental issue. So, if I were to redesign a nitrogen campaign, both nationally and globally, I would start with NOx and I would start with health. Then I would start with reviving Nazafgarh Nala and Shadra Nala, make them into revive them as rivers. At least worth boating or bathing, if not drinking. Then talk of climate change. So we just have to reverse the whole equation, and nitrogen actually gives us that opportunity. Also, another major lesson we learned from carbon is that without having a strong grounding in regional or national nitrogen assessment, a global cooperation on nitrogen is not going to happen soon, or it is not going to generate results as quickly as we would like them. Because there are multiple species of nitrogen, there are multiple sectors of human activity. Nobody will agree with any kind of global estimate, and it's going to be a complete reenactment of the 30-year-old drama that we have seen. But that's another thing that we are doing. We have almost made it mandatory, largely through Indian campaign in the United Nations, that a global process for nitrogen has to be founded on a national process or a regional process of nitrogen. And basically, we are leveraging our strengths in the Indian nitrogen assessment in the process. Why is peninsular India better in terms of ammonium hotspot? Well, part of it is, I think, geological and meteorological, because you have the Himalayas acting as a barrier um, in the north, and there is also upwelling and wind currents and meteorological processes which are different in peninsular India and different in the northern part. This much I know. The rest you have to ask the climate, some of the atmospheric scientists. But this is for sure. Part of the reason is also that the south has witnessed uh, more widespread growth of organic uh, agriculture movements in the last decade or two, and except the coastal Andhra and in very few parts where which are river fed, most of the other rain fed areas in central and south central part of India, uh, they actually don't grow so many crops in a year. So if you don't grow so many crops in a year, you don't emit so much in a year. So it's also related to how many times in a year you grow your crop and how many times in a year you leak nitrogen from agriculture. Because Punjab, Haryana, UP belt is a belt that continuously grows crops throughout the year. That is another reason for the ammonia hotspot. And but dispersal of that hotspot does not happen because of the Himalayas and the meteorological reasons. But generation of ammonia happens because of repeated cropping there. Development of science to stop nitrogen pollution. Well, yes. India in the last 10 years has very successfully identified nitrogen as one of its scientific priorities in almost all the major funding agencies, ministries, and we were largely responsible for this because we were advocating this since 2005. And for example, the newly formed Earth Science Ministry, which was previously the Ocean Development Department, also has recognized nitrogen as one of the important areas. In fact, one of the major outcomes of our Indian nitrogen assessment impact on the Indian government policy is that they, under the National Clean Air Program NCAP 2018 or 2017, the Indian government has expanded the list of nitrogen compounds that they have to measure through all the CPCB and various other measuring stations across the country, because we alerted to the government about their importance. Earlier, they were only measuring a few compounds that they need to report to the SDG. As you know, for sustainable development goals, doing nothing is no longer an option, as we had that option in the MDG. But in the SDG, doing nothing is no longer an option. Every country has to give a voluntary commitment, a nationally determined commitment. Under that commitment, certain things are specified, and some compounds of nitrogen are specified, like nitrous oxide. So they're only reporting nitrous oxide, but they're not reporting NOx, they're not reporting ammonia. Now they are collecting all of them, which means that at least without, because for us as an NGO or a group of voluntary scientists, we won't be able to do that kind of ground science without funding. So government taking it up would automatically percolate down through the entire system, and that has already happened. Um, that's as far as Prakash's question on nitrogen science is concerned. And modeling has not been one of our strengths. So some of our colleagues are picking up the modeling techniques from our partners in US, UK, Europe. We had some joint projects in the recent past, and hopefully that lacuna will also be filled. One of the problems of Indian science was that we never make a world map with Indian data. It's just here. We are so happy making a district map, a very high resolution district map, or at the most a state map, and nobody gets to collect the entire national data as an individual researcher or even as a small group. So very rarely you might see an Indian map. Nothing beyond that. So one of the quarrels we had when one of our colleagues was painting the entire India red in a global map for a UN report, we said, no, stop it. The whole India is not producing 3 crops a year. Whole India is not consuming equal into Punjab, Haryana. He just said, tomorrow the article has to go to press, give me a map with Indian data. We didn't have it. We just didn't have it. So sometimes it's a big learning. Our own, approach of Balka Kal way of doing science and not looking at Indian science as a part of the global picture has to change. Naga had some comment about nitrogen is 300 times potential. Not all nitrogen. Yeah.
It's more a comment.
Yeah. Nitrous oxide is actually 298 times over a 100-year period, and NOx about 10 times over a 100 period. Sagdhara, secondary pollutant ozone. Yes, of course, we showed the ozone in the very beginning, where we showed the nitrogen anthropogenic nitrogen cycle. NOx contributes to stratospheric ozone depletion, and that has cascade effects on Earth. Absolutely, you are right on that. Yeah, I mean, I have nothing against climate change. I'm as much interested in addressing it as any of you. Uh, but I feel that we have to look at it as a part of the overall picture, and where something that is staring us in the eye gets missed because we are so uh, conditioned to think of one thing at a time. Another question is, can zero budget natural farming, it's not nitrogen farming, it's natural farming, being projected as a means to reduce fertilizer input costs? Actually, zero budget natural farming was invented by an RSS ideologue, Suhas Palekar. I think he got a Padma Shri. Uh, to eulogize the importance of cow urine and cow dung in chemical free agriculture. So everything begins with the cow. He did a lot of work in Karnataka and parts of Maharashtra, where he was able to show that the term zero budget is a very interesting and a very enticing idea. Nobody can quarrel with that. If you can do farming without having to purchase any input, nothing like it. Everybody would welcome, including me. It's a romantic term. In reality, you do pay for labor, you do pay for a few things. Even let's ignore that. The basic point was the farmer should not have to pay cash to purchase fertilizers, pesticides, seeds. These were considered the most important inputs of the farm. Water was taken for granted, and labor was anyway taken for granted. But at least if the farmer doesn't have to purchase these three, it's a very good thing. But in the process, what they have done, they said you only use cow urine, not buffalo urine. Use only indigenous cow, not Jersey cow or any other imported breed, and use only this dung. And coat the seeds in this particular way. Sprinkle on the soil in this particular way. Actually, they are not using manure. They are not using manure. They are only using little bit of cow dung and little bit of urine mixed with jaggery and a few things to make a potion, and seeds are coated with that potion. It is called seed priming. We know that a technique called seed priming exists even in modern agriculture, but that cannot give enough nutrition for the entire life of the plant. And then you sprinkle leftovers in the soil, and then In fact, even earthworms that were also used for composting. Suhas Palekar is against composting. Suhas Palekar is against heavy use of manure, and he says he insists only on indigenous cow, not even buffalo. Some of these sort of way of approach to farming became more of a political way of developing a constituency among the farmers than delivering a real benefit on the ground. A few people always take to any suggestion that comes their way because farmers are desperate, and as long as they don't have to buy inputs from market forces, even if they get 10%, 2.1 less yields, they may still be happy and there is nothing wrong with it. But if the entire country gets less yield, will you be happy? So that's a problem. So that's about the question on zero budget natural farming. Yeah, so on the nitrogen politics, there is probably a lot more than I was able to understand so far, but definitely it seems that um, it is not considered the most important thing by many countries, and US is one of them. In fact, I have actually participated in some underground meetings where I heard US vehemently opposing any kind of international cooperation on on regulating fertilizer use in agriculture, because US is one of the largest users of chemical fertilizer in agriculture, followed by China and Brazil. The three largest countries in the world that use synthetic fertilizer are US, China, Brazil, and maybe fourth or fifth is India. Um, Indian science policy makers are warming up to nitrogen largely because we keep pestering them with information all the time. Um, but are they doing anything about it at the level of policy? Very little. For a very different reason, and you would be interested to know this. You know that in 2015, neem coated urea policy was announced by the current government, and neem oil, 0.1% neem oil coated on the urea particle is known to act as a nitrification inhibitor, essentially makes a slow release tablet out of urea, because you don't add small amount of fertilizer throughout the crop cycle. You add twice in the entire cropping season. So you can't survive on 2 meals all your life. How do you expect a crop to survive on 2 doses of fertilizer in its entire lifetime? But that is exactly how farmers do it, because providing fertilizer also takes labor, and labor is a major issue for farming. Labor saving is possible through precision agriculture, drip irrigation and all that. But drip irrigation means electricity. There are solar pumps available in some villages like Chittoor in Andhra Pradesh. Some tomato farmers on their own have gone for precision agriculture. They reduced water wastage, they reduced fertilizer wastage, did drip irrigation, boosted yields, reduced costs. But in the end, the farm prices crashed and they had to throw all the tomato on the street. So there are other problems of policy that really needs to be addressed. If farmers don't get a remunerative price for their produce, simply subsidizing urea is not going to help. It might in fact lead to wastage of urea. But if I oppose fertilizer subsidy to urea, then there is a different problem. People will say I'm a pro market guy and anti farmer guy. So there are all kinds of sensitivities that come in this issue. But one thing is for sure, having the fertilizer use is certainly possible if you use all the locally available organic waste by simply reconnecting the green and white revolution. It can even be a good business model. If somebody can establish a small business at a district level or so on, to collect all the dung and urine from the livestock farmers, keep it in the best practices, and deliver it in the best form, most nutritive form to the crop farmers, and take the stubble from the crop farmer and deliver it to the livestock farmer as a feed. It can be a good business model, but somebody needs to come forward and take it. In
Well,
fact, I was thinking of Amul kind of model where Amul goes, all the trucks go one way to pick up the milk, the other way they bring all the manure and other things. I mean, one can think of all kinds of possibilities.
Well, I think there aren't any more questions right now. I know that I'm going to have a few as I digest the implications of this talk. So I just want to mention that I took about 6 pages of notes, but I've also been summarizing some of the things you said, like restoring the link between green and white revolution, get rid of diesel for passenger cars, get back to campus housing, so these seem to be steps in a more a healthy world. Go ahead, Raghu, you were saying something.
One last point that I want to make.
Yeah.
One very simple, straightforward, way to reduce dependence on fertilizer is to revert back to legume and cereal rotation. For 5,000 years, farmers managed to get cereal production cycle after cycle without having to put any fertilizer, simply because one round they cultivated legume and atmospheric nitrogen, it leaves behind some of it in the soil. You don't need any fertilizer or very. So the problem with manure is also that if entire India, do you have that much manure? I don't think so. But if the entire agricultural production is committed to cereal and legume rotation, then whatever little top up is required, manure is more than enough. In fact, you can close all your fertilizer plants, because manure brings not only nitrogen, it also brings phosphorus. It also brings soil carbon, which is very important. It also brings sulfur, which is very important. So I think some of these 5,000-year-old perfections of human perfection of agriculture, sustainable agriculture, really teaches us something, that our short-term industrialized model of monocropping is just not sustainable by any means whatsoever.
Well, thank you for adding that very important point. And I also have the point about reviving our nalas as rivers. And I think these all suggest a very different kind of world, a world where we can also consider dealing with the carbon issue, dealing with inequalities, dealing with other environmental violations. So thank you again, Raghu, for an incredibly stimulating and important talk. I know that I'll never ever ignore nitrogen again. So in all my teaching and thinking about carbon and all of those things. So I hope it's all right if anyone needs to contact, if they have further questions, if they can send you email. All right.
Yeah, I have put my mail also on the last slide. And sorry if I have overdosed you with nitrogen a bit. It's my job.
Well, you did it extremely well. So thank you again, and thanks to everyone for attending. So I'm going to sign off now and end the session, which has been recorded, and Mayank will be sending us the link.
How many attendees did we have?
I lost count. I don't know if I counted, but we can ask Naga or Mayank. I know Naga has to leave, so we'll. Okay.
No problem.
Thank you, Mayank. All right, everyone. Take care then. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thanks for your attention.